Welcome to Africa Geotrends, your window into Africa's power, progress, and geopolitics. Asterisk before we dive in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the stories shaping Africa's future. Africa is no longer standing on the sidelines of global power politics. It is becoming one of its main arenas. For decades, the world viewed Africa through a narrow lens, either as a Western sphere of influence or as China's new economic playground. But that framing is now outdated. A deeper shift is happening. Africa today is experiencing the rise of a true multipolar engagement, where not one, but many global powers are actively competing, cooperating, and negotiating across the continent. This change is not just altering Africa's relationships with the outside world. It is reshaping global geopolitics itself. For most of the post-Cold War era, Western nations dominated Africa's political, financial, and military partnerships. European countries and the United States controlled key institutions, trade pathways, and development funding. Then China arrived with its Belt and Road Initiative, pouring billions into roads, railways, ports, and power plants across Africa. This led many observers to label Africa as moving into a Chinese sphere of influence. However, what has happened instead is more complex and more strategic from Africa's perspective. Africa did not replace Western influence with Chinese dominance. It widened the table. Today, multiple global powers are simultaneously increasing their footprint across the continent. China remains a major actor, especially in infrastructure, manufacturing support, and transport networks. Chinese companies have built railways in East Africa, port facilities in West and Southern Africa, and power stations across the continent. But China is no longer the only major external player. The United States has renewed its diplomatic, security, and economic engagement across Africa in response to growing global competition. Through initiatives focused on trade, infrastructure investment, digital technology, and security cooperation, Washington has repositioned Africa as a strategic partner rather than just a development recipient. The U.S. has increased diplomatic visits, launched large-scale business summits focused on Africa, and expanded private sector investment initiatives across technology, energy, and health sectors. At the same time, the European Union has intensified its own Africa strategy. Faced with migration concerns, energy transitions, and geopolitical rivalries, European nations have turned their attention southward. The EU has launched infrastructure initiatives aimed at competing with China's South Belt and Road, while focusing on renewable energy, transport corridors, digital connectivity, and value addition projects. European countries are also seeking stronger energy partnerships with African gas, green hydrogen, and renewable projects, especially after major global energy disruptions in recent years. But the multipolar shift does not end with China, the U.S., and Europe. The Gulf states, especially the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have emerged as powerful players in Africa's political and economic landscape. The UAE has invested heavily in African ports, logistics hubs, agricultural land, renewable energy, and mining operations. Through companies like DP World and major sovereign investment funds, Gulf nations have positioned themselves as key partners in Africa's trade and energy future. These investments are not just financial. They are strategic, strengthening Gulf states' global supply chains, food security, and influence across the Red Sea and East Africa. Turkey has also expanded its presence significantly across Africa. Over the past decade, Turkey has opened dozens of embassies across the continent, increased direct flights, signed defense agreements, and secured construction and infrastructure contracts. Turkish drones, military training, and security partnerships have become prominent in several regions, while Turkish companies dominate construction projects across West, East, and North Africa. Turkey's strategy is to build long-term political, security, and economic alliances rather than short-term influence. India has strengthened its engagement in Africa through technology, pharmaceuticals, digital payments, education, and trade. Indian companies are active in African healthcare systems, telecom networks, and agriculture. India's approach emphasizes South-South cooperation, positioning Africa as a strategic development partner rather than a dependent market. At the same time, it sees Africa as a key partner in securing critical minerals for its energy and technology industries. Russia, while more constrained economically than China or the West, has expanded its presence primarily through security partnerships, nuclear energy projects, and political relationships. Russian influence has grown in certain regions through military cooperation agreements and energy deals, especially in nuclear power development, as part of Africa's expanding electricity needs. What makes this multipolar engagement significant is not simply the number of players involved, but the way African nations are responding. In the past, African countries were often pressured to choose sides. During the Cold War, many were forced into Western or Soviet spheres. In later decades, debt and aid structures created dependencies. Today, however, African governments are actively diversifying partnerships to avoid over-reliance on any single power. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, and Morocco now host overlapping partnerships. They sign infrastructure deals with China, trade and tech agreements with the United States and Europe, energy investments with the Gulf states, and security cooperation with Turkey, Russia, and others. This diversification is not random. It is strategic. By maintaining relationships with multiple powers, African states gain leverage. They can negotiate better financing terms. They can demand local processing and technology transfer. They can avoid political pressure from any single external actor. And they can balance competing interests to secure better outcomes for their own development. This is particularly visible in Africa's resource politics. The continent holds some of the world's most important reserves of critical minerals such as cobalt, lithium, manganese, rare earths, and platinum. These minerals are essential for electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, batteries, aerospace technologies, and modern electronics. As global powers race for energy transition, Africa has become central to their supply strategies. Instead of simply exporting raw materials, several African countries are now pushing for local value addition. They are demanding processing plants, refining facilities, and manufacturing partnerships inside Africa. This forces external partners to move beyond extraction into industrial cooperation. It also allows African nations to capture more economic value from their own resources. Beyond minerals, Africa's position in global trade routes gives it strategic importance. The continent sits between major shipping lanes connecting Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Ports along the Horn of Africa, West African coast, and Southern Africa are becoming critical hubs for global trade. This has drawn massive investments into port infrastructure, transport corridors, and logistics networks, especially from China, the Gulf states, and Europe. Energy has also become a major area of multipolar engagement. Africa holds vast renewable energy potential in solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal resources. It also has large natural gas reserves. As the world searches for cleaner energy and more diversified supplies, Africa is becoming a crucial partner for both fossil fuel transitions and green energy futures. Several African countries are developing green hydrogen projects aimed at supplying future energy markets in Europe and Asia. Others are expanding gas exports to meet global demand. At the same time, decentralized energy systems, mini-grids, and renewable power projects are attracting investment from multilateral institutions, Western governments, and private investors seeking both impact and returns. On the diplomatic level, Africa's importance is rising in global decision-making spaces. The continent now plays a key role in shaping outcomes within the United Nations, global trade negotiations, climate summits, and multilateral institutions. African leaders increasingly speak with stronger collective positions on issues like climate finance, debt restructuring, global taxation, and reform of international institutions. This rising global attention reflects a shift in perception. Africa is no longer viewed solely through the lens of development challenges. It is increasingly seen as a strategic actor, a market of over 1.4 billion people, a youth-driven demographic powerhouse, and a critical component in global economic and security planning. But this multipolar engagement also comes with challenges. Competition between global powers can create political pressures, debt risks, and geopolitical tensions within African states. Navigating these relationships requires strong governance, transparent agreements, and long-term planning to ensure African interests remain prioritized. Some African leaders and policymakers are actively working to avoid the mistakes of the past, where external competition resulted in exploitation rather than development. There is increasing discussion around strengthening continental institutions, regional blocs, and economic integration to ensure Africa negotiates from a position of unity rather than fragmentation. The African Continental Free Trade Area is part of this strategy. By integrating African economies into a single market, the continent increases its bargaining power globally and reduces its dependency on external trade structures. It also allows Africa to build internal manufacturing, supply chains, and innovation ecosystems capable of supporting these external partnerships. The multipolar reality unfolding across Africa represents a historical turning point. Instead of being an object of global politics, Africa is becoming a subject within it. Instead of choosing between global powers, African nations are shaping how those powers engage on African terms. This change is gradual, complex, and not without risks. But it reveals a central truth of the 21st century. Africa is no longer just a destination for global ambitions. It is becoming the ground where new global balances are negotiated. The real story is not that the U.S., China, Europe, or the Gulf want Africa. That part is obvious. The deeper story is that Africa now has choices, and how it uses those choices will determine not just Africa's future, but the balance of global power in the decades ahead. This is what multipolar Africa truly means. Not dependency, not alignment, but leverage. And leverage, in global politics, is power. You've been watching Africa Geotrends, where Africa's moves shape the world. If you haven't already, subscribe now and stay ahead of the next big story.